For tonight's homework, you are going to compare and contrast the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. Please take notes in the following T-chart. Create a T-chart in your composition book. On the left-hand side, write details about the Great Awakening. On the right-hand side, write details about the Enlightenment. And be prepared to explain what the similarities and the differences of these two intellectual movements were. All right. As you may recall from elementary school, many colonists came to the Americas in search of religious freedom. The vast majority of them were Christian. However, the Christianity that they celebrated was extremely drab. The Great Awakening of the 1730s through 1740s gave the colonists a shared national religious experience and helped foster a revival in Christian fervor throughout the colonies, all the way south from Georgia up to Massachusetts. Great Awakening services were so popular that many of them had to be held outside in the open in nature. As you can see from this picture, people became very emotional during these. The reasons the Great Awakening often happened were pretty simple. First off, people felt that religion was extremely dry, dull, and distant. They felt like they were being preached to and did not have an active role in their religion. Most preachers also saw a problem. They felt that people needed to be concerned with inner emotion as opposed to outward religious behavior. It wasn't enough to go to church every Sunday if you weren't living your religious beliefs on every other day of the week. People in New England, since they were very literate, also felt that they could read and interpret the Bible on their own, and that they didn't necessarily need a preacher to bring them through it. This was furthering the ideals of Martin Luther during the Reformation, if you remember, in the 15th and 16th century. The outcome of the Great Awakening were very important for the colonies. First off, there was a birth of deep religious conviction in the colonies. They were already very religious. Now they were very, very, very religious. New churches built to accommodate new members, larger churches, and oftentimes colleges were founded to train new ministers. Princeton, for instance, the one is the picture to the right, they encouraged ideas of equality and the right to challenge authority. As a side note, they oftentimes challenged British authority. And birth of charity and charitable organizations were also created because obviously Christianity and charity oftentimes run hand in hand. They felt it was their duty to take care of the less fortunate. While the outcomes of the Enlightenment were similar to the Great Awakening, the way that they got there was distinctly different. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement in the late 1600s and early 1700s, which started in France. They rejected traditional ways of life and looked for a more rational and scientific way to explain the world they lived in. Where the Great Awakening sought even deeper ties with religion, the Enlightenment sought to limit religion's role, especially in the public and government institutions. What the Enlightenment taught was quite simple. It stated that generally people are good and it's that their environment influences them. This is the idea that people are born with a clean slate and that they are nurtured to be the way that they are. This is opposed to many religious ideas that people are generally born with the temperament that they have. They use scientific reason in order to answer life's mysteries. They used a scientific method and applied it to everyday life. They felt that science and reason could also answer man's questions concerning government and their general self. These governmental ideas would be applied in the United States as it grew. They are the basis of the Declaration of Independence. One of the most important Enlightenment thinkers, and the only one we'll talk about today, was an Englishman by the name of John Locke. John Locke preached during the late 17th century, that's the 1600s. He did not oppose monarchies like many of his contemporaries did, because he felt that people were governed by not a king, but a social contract. That if people felt that they should be governed by a king and they were okay with that, then that was fine. Only if that king was being oppressive and the people wanted to throw him off could they do so. He also believed that all men were born with what we call natural rights. That's life, liberty, and property. I know that probably sounds familiar because it's one of the lines in the Declaration of Independence, but note the very important difference is instead of pursuit of happiness. Now, the outcomes of the Enlightenment were major on the Americas. First off, there was a great surge of literacy in the colonies. People began to found new schools in towns and villages where they before would not have had schools, specifically in the New England colonies. Newspapers, books, and publications began to increase tenfold. The printing press became a useful tool in the colonies, and many people became what we would call deists, meaning that they weren't overtly religious. They believed in God or a God, but they felt that God was like a clockmaker, meaning that he created a clock, he wound the clock, and then he let the clock go. Instead of influencing the clock's daily business and daily lives, he felt that the other ideas of the Enlightenment were very important, especially the idea that people were born with natural rights. The idea that people could be born with life, liberty, and property was absurd in Europe at the time, where there was strict and rigid social hierarchies dating all the way back to the Middle Ages. Also, it was unseen then that government had an obligation to protect those natural rights. Most people believed that people were individualized and they owed government money. However, it was not up to the government to protect those rights. Also, kings have no right to govern people if the people do not want them to be governed by a king. The people empower government and government officials versus the king governing. Now that you have the basic ideas of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, and you've taken notes on either side of the T-chart, what I would like you to do now is briefly explain how these beliefs are similar and how are they different. Also, within your answer, I would like you to think about what levels of society would each of these beliefs appeal to. For instance, who would the poor or which ideology would the poor like more, and which ideology would the rich like more? Which one would the poor have more access to, and which one would the rich have more access to? These are the questions that we will be discussing tomorrow in class. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow.